Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Susan Faraday. I'm an associate professor at the School of Marine and Environmental Programs at UNE, and I will be your host for today's event. I am also a member of UNE's Planetary Health Council Events Committee, part of the group that is coordinating today's event. Since 2017, UNE has been an institutional member of the International Planetary Health Alliance. The Alliance is a Harvard-led consortium of more than 240 universities, non-governmental organizations, and other institutions spanning more than 40 countries. At UNE, our Planetary Health Council is working to strengthen bridges between our robust environmental sciences and health professions, and to provide planetary health content through academics, research, and events just like this one today. A couple of housekeeping points as we get going and we have more people joining us. Please be sure to mute your audio as you are participating in the event. You can use the chat throughout the event to post any questions or comments. We aren't going to be taking questions in between our panelists' presentations, but we've reserved time at the end. And we have crack members of our team monitoring the chat both in Zoom and in Facebook, so we'll be sure to capture your comments. Today's event is brought to you through a partnership between the Planetary Health Council and the Center for Excellence in Collaborative Education. This event is wrapping up a 6-part series exploring the broad impacts of COVID-19 across human and environmental issues and what we can learn from this to apply to face the impacts of climate change. Our title today in this last event is Pandemic Reflections, People, Planet, and Profits. 3 of our experts at UNE will share their perspectives on what we can learn from the pandemic to strengthen our preparedness for climate change, particularly as it's related to sustainability. For those students who are interested in interprofessional competencies, this event will address the competencies of values and ethics, teams, and teamwork, and can be applied toward UNE students' interprofessional honors distinction badge. So to tee us off here, I'm going to introduce our student discussion facilitator, Julia Mast. Julia?
Hi, everybody. I'm Julia Mast. I'm currently a first semester junior. I'm majoring in environmental science and marine biology. And I'm inviting you guys throughout the presentation to please add any questions or comments into the chat function and to include your major, program, department, or profession, as well as where you're from. And I'm going to hand it off to our first panelist, Dr. Bethany Woodworth, to introduce herself.
Thank you, Julia. My name is Bethany Woodworth, and I'm a faculty member in the School of Marine and Environmental Programs, and I coordinate UNE's climate change program. I'm bringing to the table today some background in disease ecology, environmental health, climate change, and sustainability, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you and hearing from my co-panelists. I'm going to pass the microphone over to Ms. Alethea Caridi to introduce herself.
Thanks, Bethany. So my name is Alethea Caridi, and I'm the Assistant Director for Sustainability at the University of New England. I've been in this role for about 12 and a half years. I do some adjunct work as well with the School of Marine Environmental Programs and also for a beekeeping workshop in the fall semester. And I'm really excited to be here and to share some of my experiences with everyone. So I'm going to hand it off to Noah now. Noah Perlett.
Hello, everyone. I'm Noah Perlett. I'm a professor in the School of Marine and Environmental Programs. I'm a ornithologist by day. So I study birds, mostly doing field-based research and teaching. But along from that, I have also been really active over my time at UNE in campus sustainability, really working with things like the Environmental Council and Alethea's office and many others to try to find ways to be more sustainable. So I'm happy to be here.
Terrific. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all for participating. And I think we're all really looking forward to hearing the different perspectives you're all going to share on this important topic. Just a reminder before I turn to our first panelist, as you're joining, if you could please remember to mute your audio function. And by all means, throughout the presentations, use the chat function to enter your questions and comments. We'll have time at the end to bring them back to the panelists. Bethany?
Thank you so much, Susan. It's a great pleasure to be here today. In this first talk of the hour, I would plan to sketch the broad outlines of how COVID-19 pandemic interacts with the environment around us and sustainability. And then I'll pass it on to my colleagues, Alethea and Noah, to discuss how to bring these observations down to the community and the personal level. Next slide. So it was a very dark spring and summer for all of us throughout the world. We were all kind of blindsided by the first global pandemic in our lifetimes. With lockdowns and full hospitals and isolation and job losses, we tried to persevere and we looked desperately for a way to find some good in everything that was happening. Next slide. The first silver lining that we found was that the air was cleaner. We could see farther, the air smelled better. The Himalayas were visible in the distance for the first time in decades in some places, and the sky was blue instead of gray in Beijing. Next slide. This happened, of course, because we had instituted lockdowns in many places around the world, causing empty roads, shuttered factories, and all of this led to a drastic reduction in air pollution in cities around the world. Next slide. These two satellite images show the concentration of nitrogen dioxide in the air above China before and after lockdowns, photos taken just 2 months apart. We saw similar decreases in nitrous oxides all over the world, in Rome, Madrid, Brazil, India, and the United States. Next slide. Particulate matter 2.5 is another common air pollutant that comes from fossil fuel burning. It's especially dangerous because it's so small, it's less than 2.5 micrometers, so it can lodge deep into the lungs and pass into the bloodstream. In cities around the world, particulate matter 2.5 fell as much as 70%. The more polluted a city was prior to the shutdown, the more drastic and dramatic the reduction. Now, this is really good news. The World Health Organization estimates that air pollution kills about 7 million people every year. Moreover, we now know that air pollution worsens coronavirus health concerns. So even a temporary reduction in the amount of air pollution can help us flatten the curve and lower the burden on healthcare systems. So the pandemic gave us a kind of a breather from air pollution, if you will. Next slide. Reductions were also seen in carbon dioxide, the primary contributor to the climate change. I think this is a remarkable slide because it begins in 1880, and you can see the decline from January to May of 2020 while we were in lockdowns. Daily global carbon emissions were down by 17% compared to the same time last year. Next slide. And the pandemic had other good news for the climate. The reduced demand for oil led to plummeting oil prices. Does everybody remember when oil prices went negative on April 20th of 2020? So this changed the economics of oil extraction. Tar sands mining, shown here on the right, is one of the most polluting forms of oil extraction. In February 2020, a Canadian tar sands plan that was 9 years in the making collapsed due to the twin burdens of falling oil prices and environmental concerns. As a result, 24,000 acres of pristine boreal forest were conserved, and all of that carbon stayed in the ground. Next slide. Another positive effect of lockdown was an apparent explosion in wildlife sightings. As traffic vanished and the pace of daily life slowed, people were commenting on how many more animals they were seeing and how many more birds seemed to be singing. And this wasn't just our imagination. Elizabeth Derryberry and her colleagues in San Francisco found that white-crowned sparrows were not only singing more often, but even singing at different frequencies in the quieter city. Next slide. Less human activity made it possible for animals to move about more freely. Scientists are taking advantage of this natural experiment to study how human activities affect animal behavior. For example, less light pollution and darker skies are probably going to be good for migrating birds and hatchling sea turtles. Next slide. Less traffic led to less road mortality and ultimately more reproduction. Lockdown in Maine came just as vernal pools were melting and spotted salamanders were crossing the road to get to their mating pools. Next slide. And finally, as an educator and a nature lover, I have to say I rejoice in the fact that the one side effect of the pandemic was that it forced us all to slow down and spend more time outside in nature. I think these are all really good things. Next slide. So these are all really good things, and we should take heart from them. But I think it would be unwise not to also take stock of the negative impacts so that we can take steps and plan how to deal with them. Next slide. For the first of all, these changes are temporary. We still have the same cars, the same polluting industries, the same houses, the same roads. And so as soon as the restrictions are released, we can expect to go right back to where we were. And in fact, this is what we're seeing in China. Second, although greenhouse gas emissions are lower, how much we put out, the actual concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is still growing. It's just growing a little bit more slowly. And this, I think, illustrates how difficult the task will be of getting climate change under control. And this may be actually a good thing because it allows us to be a little bit more realistic about the size of the task ahead of us. Next slide. So turning to other environmental impacts, it won't surprise you to know that coronavirus precautions have led to an explosion in the use of single-use PPE, single-use takeout containers, disposable plastic bags, and so the waste stream is burgeoning. Next slide. Moreover, many cities have delayed or rescinded bans that they had planned on single-use plastics. They're afraid that reusables will spread disease, and a lot of cities paused their recycling programs for the same reason. Next slide. In another realm, travel restrictions have hit the international tourist industry hard. On this map, the red areas show where tourism has fallen the most precipitously, and you can see particularly developing countries. Next slide. What that means on the ground is a reduction in tourism decreases the amount of funds available for park management, and several studies have found upticks in poaching and illegal logging as a result. Also, sadly, the loss of livelihoods has been particularly hard on the local communities surrounding those parks. Next slide. Also, understandably, many governments are really anxious to get their economies going again. But this can lead to bad decisions if they end up trying to jumpstart or prop up dirty fossil fuel infrastructure. In China, there's been a rush since the pandemic to approve new coal-fired power plants. Because this infrastructure is going to last for decades, this short-term economic gain is going to result in a long-term negative impact on the climate. Next slide. And many governments, including the United States and Brazil, have basically stopped enforcement of environmental regulations for the time being in an effort to boost economic recovery. The pandemic is absorbing the public's attention, so these changes are getting less pushback than they would in normal times. Next slide. And finally, the twin health and economic crises threaten to pull our and our leaders' attention away from the longer-term issue of climate change. Climate change had finally been moving up the political agenda after the September 2019 climate strikes that were led primarily by youth across the world. Next slide. The question then becomes, what will our priorities be? Obviously, we need to protect people from the pandemic, and we need to take action to protect people's livelihoods. So how do we prioritize environmental sustainability in light of that, this new reality? We as citizens need to be attentive and proactive. We need to take steps to minimize our personal ecological footprints, certainly. But we also need to use our power as citizens to pressure world leaders to stimulate their economies in ways that are environmentally sound, socially just, and climate friendly. We must join and support the young people in the climate movement. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, shown here, provide a potential framework for how to approach the pandemic recovery. It includes 17 goals for an equitable, just, and healthy world. Let's take this opportunity to reimagine the future that we want to live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bethany, for that terrific presentation to start us off. I'm now going to turn to Ms. Alethea Caridi, who's going to consider these topics from a slightly different perspective related to our institution right here in Biddeford. Alethea?
Thank you. I just want to say first that I really appreciate Bethany helping us to put sustainability during the pandemic into context. I think it's important to have a broader, more global understanding of the impacts and then sort of narrow our focus down to the local or community level. And I'm hoping to provide the context of the pandemic impacts on sustainability at our institutional level at this point. So Susan, can you put up that first slide? Great. So there was an article recently in Science Direct that seemed like the perfect segue from Bethany's segment to mine. What was noted in the research and in similar other articles is that there are clear connections that can be drawn between the pandemic, which is a global health, public health crisis, and climate change, a global environmental crisis causing very similar public health issues. And I really liked this graphic from the article because it succinctly depicts the positive and negative sustainability impacts of the pandemic at a global level. And what I recognized is that it was something that I could have actually created to illustrate what we've seen at the community and institutional levels as well. The three biggest areas that I've seen impacted at UNE in my role include waste, energy, and transportation. And we have some limited data that we can share about two of these, waste and energy, and examples of the impact on transportation. Next slide. I have a few graphs to show you for illustration purposes. However, data is only as good as our collection tools, right? So each fall, we conduct an audit with our waste hauler. They measure the weight of our dumpsters on campus for 3 weeks. And then we have to extrapolate that over the 36-week period of the academic year. We do have 1 trash and 2 recycling compactors in addition to this that are weighed every time they're emptied. So this graph is depicting the tons of waste for the last 5 fiscal years. That fiscal year runs from June 1st to May 31st. And in terms of waste, we saw a decline in our calculated waste last fiscal year by about 35% from the average of the previous 4 years. This can be largely explained by the lack of people on campus from mid-March through the end of May, about 2.5 months. Next slide. And then when we look at just the waste audit for the 3-week period each October and compare just last month's with the previous 4 Octobers, we also see a reduction of about 21%. Next slide. And then the food waste reduction is even more pronounced. We only have measured data for the last 2 fall seasons for comparison, but so our dining hall waste is picked up by Garbage to Garden and brought to Benson Farms in Gorham for composting. But you can see the drastic reduction in food waste by almost 72% for the months of August, September, and October from the previous 2 years. Next slide. But how does this make sense when we know intuitively that our consumption patterns have changed significantly, just like Bethany said? Yes, well, we have fewer people on campus, and I'm not aware of any data collection through human resources or the registrar's office to determine the number of people on campus daily compared to an analogous period before the pandemic. I do know that institutional research and data analytics at UNE tracks the total number of employees and student population, but I don't think anybody is counting the number of people on campus on any given day or week. So all of our assumptions about how many people were on campus before the pandemic can be thrown away now with hybrid learning and remote work. But we do measure the number of students in our residence halls. And this fall, there were 12% fewer than the average of the previous 4 years. We also know that there are fewer events on campus, which means fewer conferences, fewer speakers that draw community members, fewer student activities, fewer athletic events. All of those typically produce waste, and some of them quite a bit of it. Next slide. Most notable in terms of waste is the increased use of personal protective equipment, PPE, and single-use containers. As Bethany had pointed out, UNE has purchased over 24,000 respirators and 45,000 surgical masks, 72,000 pairs of gloves, and 2,000 isolation gowns, in addition to goggles, Tyvek suits, booties, face shields, mask straps, and extenders. And all of these are disposable. Parkhurst, our dining service partner, is serving about half the number of meals to people on a daily basis due to space limitations from social distancing requirements. But we are going through disposable to-go materials like crazy. Parkhurst is estimating about 6,500 microwavable clamshells, 65,000 utensil sets, metal foil containers, and cold cups, and about 24,000 hot cups just this semester alone. Again, all of it is disposable and single use. So those sustainable habits of reusable water bottles and travel mugs for hot beverages and reusable straws and napkins and reusable grocery bags, those were all becoming social norms. But the pandemic has sort of turned us all around, and disposable items have become our crutch in an attempt to slow the spread of COVID. Next slide. So turning our attention to energy, I only have data to share for electricity, and we can't forget that energy also includes fossil fuels like heating oils, propane, and natural gas, all of which UNE burns to heat our buildings. We do have secondary electrical meters on a number of our buildings on the Biddeford campus, not as many on Portland. But these allow me to monitor to some degree the electricity consumption of these buildings. This first graph shows the academic and business buildings, with Alphon Forum and Alphon Center for Health Sciences being the largest electricity consuming buildings on campus. And I've provided March 2019 to present data so that you can see a comparison for the period before the pandemic to date. Next slide. And this is the residential building electricity consumption for the same time period. You can note in both of these graphs that while there are observable dips in the electricity consumption, none of the buildings experienced a significantly reduced consumption pattern. Next slide. This graph compares 9 of those academic buildings and 9 of the residential buildings that all have those secondary meters with electricity consumption in just August, September, and October, comparing 2019 to 2020. And again, a decrease, but not significant. And I think the take-home message in all of these graphs is that our buildings have lives of their own, regardless of whether they have occupants. We saw declines during our shutdown period, but only so much because our systems have to remain operational enough to prevent property damage. Next slide. And I expect all forms of building energy consumption to increase during the colder months. The Centers for Disease Control have issued guidance for building operations to increase ventilation to reduce the spread of COVID. Their recommendation is to increase percentage of outside air to as high as 100%. And this means heating air as it comes into the building, very cold air, and exhausting that heated air quickly, leaving very little time for heat recovery. Next slide. Transitioning now to transportation, probably the most noticeable impact from a sustainability perspective that we all experienced was the immediate and sweeping halt of travel, both long distance and local. So stay-at-home orders kept us all at home, and remote work became the norm for many months. As Bethany pointed out, our city air got a little cleaner and gas prices dropped as demand plummeted. But as we've started to reopen, some of our conservation behaviors have fallen by the wayside. UNE specifically lost several alternative transportation options this year. Some of them were pandemic related and others less so. The intercampus connector, that bus that brought folks back and forth between the Portland and Biddeford campuses, was slated to end due to lower ridership than necessary. And Zipcar, the car share option on the Biddeford campus, left campus with no replacement. And this was one of our incentives that we offered to first year students to encourage them to leave their cars at home. And then Zagster, our very popular bike share option that helped reduce our cross-campus car traffic, fell victim to COVID as a company. Go Main, our carpool matching program, became hard to promote because we're doing less group travel. Our public transit options have remained with the Yellow Line and Greater Portland Metro, but with limited seating to allow for social distancing. So while our emissions from transportation went down initially, I do worry that we are taking a serious step back from any gains that we had in sort of normalizing alternative transportation options. Next slide. So what has COVID meant for sustainability at UNE? It's meant that our institutional footprint has sort of shifted to individuals. What's happening in our campus buildings isn't happening in our is happening now in our homes in terms of energy consumption and waste generation. And what we could consolidate for transportation is now more spread out. It's shown us that there's an environmental cost to our structures and operations with or without a full population on campus. But it also provides us with some opportunities to plan for our community's resilience through distributed renewable energy generation, innovative design, education and awareness spreading like this event, and stakeholder engagement as well. And Susan, you can stop the slides if you want. Because I just wanted to say in conclusion that, the economic fallout as a result of the pandemic is real, and our institution is feeling it in lower student enrollment and higher costs of operations. While the spread of the disease and social distancing to prevent further spread is seriously impacting our economy, our response to climate change should be to strengthen the economy by bringing people together to advocate and to plan and to collaborate and to train and to innovate. We can do all of this at the global and national levels, but we may actually feel more sense of gratification when we work a little closer to home at the institutional, community, and local levels, and certainly at the individual level as well. And I think that's where Noah comes in. So
Thank you so much. To him. Thank you so much, Alethea. I very much appreciate bringing it home. So now we'll wrap up with our third panelist, Professor Noah Perlett. Just a reminder to folks, we are going to have time afterwards for addressing your questions and comments for any of our panelists. Just put them in the chat function and we will collect them at the end. So Noah, I'll kick it off to you.
Thank you. So I'd like to start before I even show any slides and ask everybody who's listening or watching to think about two things. And this is a perfect bridge from Alethea and Bethany's previous talks. And the first is, so you've seen decreases in emissions. And I really want you to think about that. Are these emissions actually decreasing or are they shifting? That's a really important thing for you to self-reflect on about, are we actually lowering emissions or are we just moving them to different point sources? And the second is how we as individuals are going to make changes based on the realities of our new lives. And we are approaching in just a couple weeks, perhaps the single greatest opportunity for all of us to have conversations with our families. And while Thanksgiving might be smaller tables, I really want to encourage you all to think about the things that both Bethany and Alethea have showed you and what's coming up, the data I'm going to share with you, and to have discussions with your family over Thanksgiving about the places that you live and spend time. And so I think the data that I'm going to show you will kind of help speak to that. Okay, next slide, please. So we are incredibly lucky with UNE's position both in Biddeford and Portland to have a connection that runs almost between campuses called the Eastern Trail. The Eastern Trail is part of the Eastern Greenway, which stretches from the border of Maine, the northern border of Maine, all the way to Florida. And in Maine, the section is called the Eastern Trail. And it's an old railway that has been transformed into a trail, effectively, a very smooth, clean, easy trail. And the vision for this is to go from Buglight Park in South Portland all the way to the border of New Hampshire. And the largest section of it largest continuous section right now goes from Scarborough to Saco. And I believe it's around 14 miles of continuous trail. It's very soon going to be connected all the way to South Portland by building one additional trail. And this image shows you what this looks like. This trail has proven to be a lifesaver for huge numbers of in our community over the last 6 months. It's given them spaces where they can go out and recreate in many different ways. Here in this image, you see lots of people biking, but it's everything from walking kids to dog walking to exploring wildlife along the trail. Next slide, please. The use of this trail has come with a really important component of change in our economy, and that is with bicycle sales. Bicycle sales since last spring have gone absolutely out of the roof, blown things away. And these data help show you some of that component. So here you can see that in March, from comparing March from the last 2 years, leisure bikes increased in sales by 121%. Now, this is an amazing opportunity to think about how we as Americans are moving around, particularly moving around without using carbon. This in and of itself seems like a really, really, really positive thing. And I do want to say that while we're not talking a lot about here creating jobs necessarily, one important component to this for your communities to think about is where are bikes coming from financially? Most of the bike sales that are occurring in New England are occurring in small businesses. And these small businesses have really been effective in keeping people employed in otherwise really turbulent times with increasing unemployment. And that's an important note here. However, this comes with a risk. If you can go to the next slide. This risk continues that while bike sales continue to increase, we may have loved them too much too fast. And so what do I mean by that? The Scarborough Marsh Trail that I just showed you had a daily usership increase of 300%. 300% increase per day of the number of people that were on the trail. The people that administer the trail have been concerned that it's getting overused. There's the trail is actually physically expanded. It's gotten wider because of the number of people on there. And likewise, there's been many accounts of people who have actually stopped using it as their primary transportation corridor because of the number of people on the trail. And so here I've included one case study of a librarian who works in Scarborough, and she would use the trail as her method of getting to work for 9 months a year. And when the library reopened this late spring or early summer, she actually had to stop riding her bike and then transfer those emissions back to her car, where she now had to start commuting by car. And so this is sort of an interesting juxtaposition of, on one hand, yes, this is great news. Bikes are becoming more accessible and more common in our communities. However, they come possibly with a cost of that people that were using our infrastructure around biking are maybe using it less because of the number of people that are in front of them on the trails. So an interesting thing, and I'm not talking about these things as if I have a silver bullet explanation of what's the right thing to do, but more so for us to think about the choices that we're making. All right, next slide, please. So I'd next like to talk about 3 different things that happen in our houses. The first is how we heat our homes. And this is really a large discussion about incentives. We have federal, state, and nonprofit incentives that are available to us, regardless of what state you live in. And that's really important. This is in Maine and many other states. The goal of these incentives is to increase the sustainability of your home. In 2020, the US Environmental Protection Agency dramatically changed the emission criteria for wood stoves for homes. And this change is, as when I say dramatic, there's a huge change in efficiency and the size of the particles that are emitted from these wood stoves. And this change came with only but based on technology, and the technology comes with a cost. And that cost notably increased for purchasing wood stoves for your homes. The American Lung Association, who had been advocating vociferously for these changes, and rightfully so, said, well, we need to put our money where our mouth is. And they created an incentive program for individual homeowners to supply them with $1,000 in going to the price of the wood stove. Now, this is a really exciting opportunity. It's also really exciting to show that it's a nonprofit organization that's coming in here and making this decision rather than relying on a federal state agency. However, the caveat of this is that it's so wildly successful that they burned through their entire budget and now are maintaining a massive waiting list of people. And so there's a huge demand of people who want to buy these stoves and replace the stoves and make their communities with more sustainable, cleaner air, but they're unable to access that opportunity because of the lack of funds. So an interesting conflict we have here. Next slide, please. The second one I want to talk about is a program that started, I believe, 2 years ago here in Maine, where we joined many other states in the country and now offering rebates for the purchase of electric vehicles. There's two types of electric vehicles that are involved here. One is a BEV, which is a battery electric vehicle. So it's a car that runs exclusively on batteries. And then there's a second type, which is called a PHEV, a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, which means that this car can drive for a certain number of miles purely on battery. And then when those batteries are exhausted, the car shifts over to a gas engine. And when you're looking at this figure, you can see that there are different rebate amounts offered now by the state to purchase these vehicles. So the federal government can offer up to $7,500 per car of a rebate, and that depends on the size of the battery in the car that you purchase. And then the state of Maine now is also offering $2,000, between $1,000 and $2,000, depending on the car you purchase. Interestingly enough, CMP, the power provider for our region, is also offering funds but only for very specific cars. They've picked out a group of cars. So next, I'd like to show you sort of the trends on the next slide of rebates in Maine. So this is the data for the number of rebates that were turned in across the state going from January through the end of October. And you can see that the number of rebates redeemed decreased by 2/3 from the very beginning of the pandemic to the bottom of it, and then has skyrocketed up and is now 4 times as much as it was at the peak of the pandemic. And it is now higher than it was in the winter. And so that is really good news, that people are looking at cars and looking at options and deciding to make more sustainable choices for the cars that they buy. So this is great. However, if you look at all these bars here, you can see that the sample sizes are pretty small. You know, in October, the state only received 88 rebates. That is less than 2% of all of the cars that were purchased in the state of Maine. And so while there's clearly been growth in the number of electric vehicles that have been purchased, there still is a long way to go in the number across the state. Okay, so next, please. So last, I'd like to talk about heat pumps. And heat pumps are really fascinating methods of heating and cooling homes or commercial spaces. And they run on electricity. And this is really important to discuss, similar to cars, because we can control the emissions of electricity fairly well. Not only we can control them, we can make them zero based on choices, things like having the power created on our rooftops, or if you can't have it on your rooftops, you can purchase into a solar farm in the state. And heat pumps are one way that you can take away the emissions associated with otherwise heating and cooling your house from natural gas or oil and shift it into electricity, and particularly zero emission electricity. So Efficiency Maine also offers an incentive program, which is on the next slide. And this shows you the number of rebates that have come in over the pandemic. And what's really exciting and kind of surprising is you can see that they were fairly flat from January through kind of midsummer. And then over the last few months, they have absolutely skyrocketed. And that is a really fascinating piece of data showing that people are looking at their homes and making a decision that we're going to do this in a more sustainable way. We're going to use these rebates and shift over to our heating and cooling onto electricity. So that's really good news. So that's the end of what I wanted to share. And again, I want to just ask you all to think about the things that you're seeing today and think and reflect on how you can take this information and go back into your families and your homes and make sustainable choices all around. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you to all our panelists. You've provided so much for us all to consider. So now it's your turn. Please type in any questions, comments into the chat function. If you have a specific panelist you'd like to address that question to, if you'd like to also share your background, your profession, or your major, that would be great too, so we can get to know you. So I'm gonna turn now to our crack student facilitator, Julia, and see if we've got anything to lobby towards our panelists.
Just like from looking at the chat box, we've had a lot of discussion about bike theft, which I think is interesting because it just kind of shows that there's a lot of unforeseen consequences that have come from the pandemic and climate change, because now everyone has bikes, but there's an increased amount of theft. If you guys have anything to comment on that, it's been a popular conversation in the chat box.
I don't really know much about bike theft in Portland or Biddeford or otherwise, but my initial impression is that, look, unemployment is real. Unemployment is real, and people have had some really hard times based on losing their employment, especially people who are already perhaps having a tough time financially. And that, sometimes when you're out straight, that's what you lead to, right? And we need to sometimes look at these people and try to be more caring rather than punitive.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on bikes.
And then also when we were talking about the building energy, there's a lot of people asking about, like, what can we change to limit the amount of passive energy that's being used in our buildings on campus.
Yeah, I did see that. And I will say that the facilities department did take immediate steps when we sent the students home in March to really get into the buildings and turn off and unplug and turn down as many systems as they felt comfortable doing. And I guess that's one of the things that I was a little surprised at. I mean, I helped out with that effort, going around and unplugging AV equipment, all of those AV podiums that have a gazillion plugs attached to them. And our HVAC folks turned a lot of equipment down. And I was really anticipating seeing bigger savings. And that's what I was talking about with our buildings have a life of their own, whether we're in them or not. We do see reductions, but they're not as huge as I was expecting them to be. And mold is a real issue, especially in the summertime. So we do need to keep the HVAC systems operational so that we don't end up with, mold in our carpets and whatnot. So we did take drastic steps, but it wasn't enough. And I think that is something that we really need to be conscious of when we're looking at building new buildings and renovating old buildings, to make sure that our systems are as energy efficient as possible.
We just got another question from Chris Hall in the chat that's sort of related to that. they've seen some reporting that urban density uses less energy than the same number of people in a rural setting. Does this extrapolate to the work from home model? Do we use less energy working all together on campus than we do separately working and learning from home?
That's a really great question. I think of it sort of in terms of almost like bulk purchasing or something like that. That when you've got concentrations of people, then it does require less energy overall. If you think about the slight reductions of not having folks on campus, by having them here, you're increasing your energy consumption a little bit. But then when you send them all home, we're still consuming quite a bit to keep our buildings operational here. And on top of that, everybody is using energy more at home, whether it's electricity or heat. So I think that is probably true, Chris. Yeah, and I think that's why Noah's points about what can we be doing at home to not be adding to that footprint overall. You know, that last slide that I had about an institutional footprint, we are shifting that responsibility and that burden onto each individual home, family unit. So trying to reduce our footprint at home, I think is important also during this time.
Yeah. And we just got an interesting question from Lee Coate. Will there be new incentives coming for people with better energy efficiency with the new administration?
I can take that. I think it's a little too early to know exactly what the new administration will be planning, but there's no question that it won't get any worse. In other words, we only can get better from here. The new administration has committed that the first action on the first day in January will be to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, and I think that signals that we should be expecting more support for renewable energy and climate-friendly and sustainability policies going forward. So I don't know anything specifically about what they've planned, but I look forward to finding out.
Yeah.
I think we need to wrap up so we can hear a final concluding remarks from our panelists. Thank you, everybody who participated in giving us some provocative questions and to hear from our experts. I want to remind everybody that we have an attendance survey, which is going to be posted in the chat. Please do that before you leave. So I like that we ended with a question about what can we think about for the future from the new administration. So I want to pose for each of our panelists, if you could impart to the next generation, to all our UNE students, regardless of whether they're an undergraduate, graduate, or College of Medicine, with one inspirational message for the future, what would it be? Bethany, what would it be?
One of the things that gives me the most hope, and that I hope will also inspire other listeners on the call, is the great increase in political participation in last week's election here in the United States, and especially among young people and people of color. And I think that a lot of people, if asked, would say that they really don't like politics. But in actual fact, I think there's a growing awareness that policy, whether it's policy on coronavirus protections or environmental policy, is really one of the most important ways that we can shape the future and make the future what we would like it to be. So I would encourage people to continue their engagement with the political and the policy process into the future.
Alethea, your inspiring parting thought.
I think one of the things that brings me inspiration is that when I really take a step back and I look at the connections and linkages that people are making to bring meaning to the climate crisis, we are seeing it with the pandemic for sure, but we're also hearing about and developing like a greater understanding about environmental and social justice. For a long time, we've seen connections in the role that higher ed can play in influencing climate mitigation. And then we saw linkages with the financial sector and businesses, with the power of divestment and inclusion of corporate responsibility reporting and goal setting. And now I see more awareness about the power of our healthcare industry and linking human and environmental health. So each one of these linkages, it brings new people to the table to advocate and to make changes in their sector, all while also getting out of their own silos and collaborating with others. So witnessing and becoming more aware myself of the connections that can be made, it builds common ground, and I think it brings more people to the table with sort of unique perspectives and talents and intelligences. So that's the thing that brings me hope, and I encourage other people to do, is to just continue to be looking specifically for those linkages that can bring meaning to the climate crisis in lots of different areas.
Thanks, Alethea. Noah, our parting inspirational thought for the day?
Yeah, my thought is that the world wants to hear your voice, and they want to hear how you see things and what's important to you. And when I say the world, I mean everything from the people that you're going to see at Thanksgiving to the administration at UNE. That everybody wants to hear your voice in creating what's important. And the only way we can hear those voices is if you all speak up and say clearly what you want and what you think. So I really want to encourage you to do that.
Well, if we were live and in person, I would invite everybody to applaud and thank our panelists. I'm going to do it for you, virtual applause. I want to thank all of our panelists today and everybody who participated for some really thought-provoking conversations, everything from the very local level to the international level, and lots of room in between. So thank you. One way you can have your voice heard is continue to communicate with our panelists today. I know they would love to hear from you. We had to give them a very brief amount of time today, so there's many other conversations that could be had. The other way you can be heard is by filling out our very brief attendance survey. Please do that. We really appreciate the feedback. Finally, I want to thank everybody who helped put this on. This was truly a team effort, not just today. I feel like I got a back cleanup because this is the end of the whole series, but these events have been running about once a month since the summer, and we've covered a lot of ground. Getting to Alethea's point about linkages, I think this series really illustrates the number of linkages between human health, environmental health, and everything that we do here at UNE, both from the health professions perspective to marine and environmental research and everything else. So I particularly want to thank my colleagues, Colin Bader and Alethea Caridi on the Planetary Health Council for putting together this series. From our perspective, also our colleagues in CC, Chris Hall, Lisa Boucher-Hartman, Michelle Cody, for their input and coordination as well. They really broke the mold with their events in the summer, and we've benefited mightily from their expertise. Finally, the unseen but masterful heroes in the background, Lee Cody and Dave D'Adiego, we couldn't do any of this without you, so thank you. So again, please fill out the survey. We'd welcome your thoughts and input about future events. I think Planetary Health Council at UNE is positioned at exactly the right place at the right time, so we'd love to know what you thought of today and what we might be able to put on in the future. Again, please remember to fill out the survey. Students who are interested in the interprofessional competencies, be sure you complete that process. So with that, thank you everybody for participating today. Have a terrific day and safe and productive end of the semester.